The sign above the motel office read, "Sundown Motor Inn," but half the letters had burned out years ago, leaving something closer to unknown Mo or N, which Nora Hayes thought was about the most honest thing she had ever seen in her life. Room 11 was at the far end of the row, tucked against a concrete wall that sweated in the August heat. The carpet was the color of something that used to be green. The window unit rattled like it was arguing with itself. And every morning, when the sun came through the gap in the curtains at 6:15 and laid a bar of light across the floor, Nora would lie still for exactly 40 seconds before she let herself think about the day. The 40 seconds were important. She had learned that. Before the thinking started, before the math began its relentless crawl through her skull, and there was just light on the carpet and the sound of her children breathing. Cleo, 8 years old, slept on the near bed with her knees pulled up and one arm draped over the edge like she was reaching for something in a dream. Eli, 5, was burrowed under the sheet on the far side, only the top of his dark head visible, moving slightly with each breath. Those 40 seconds were the only part of the day that cost nothing. Then the thinking started. $62.40 in her checking account, 14 days left on the weekly motel rate. The manager, a heavyset man named Gerald, who smelled of cigarettes and synthetic pine, had already told her once, gently, and then once not so gently, that he couldn't keep extending her on goodwill alone. The electricity bill for the little plug-in fan she was running had been added to her account without warning. The children needed school supplies because Cleo was starting 3rd grade in 3 weeks, and Eli would be enrolled in kindergarten at whatever school district they landed in, which Nora did not yet know because she did not yet know where they were going to be. She was 33 years old. She had worked at Fenwick's Bakery on the east side of Kansas City for 6 years, opening at 4:30 in the morning, mixing dough until her shoulders ached, learning every recipe by heart, eventually becoming the one the owner called first when anything went wrong. She had been good at it. She had loved it, even on the exhausting days, because there was something deeply satisfying about making something real with your hands, and something that smelled like warmth and fed people. Fenwick's had closed 8 months ago. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a padlock on the door one Tuesday morning, and a laminated notice in the window thanking customers for their years of support. The owner had been apologetic on the phone, almost tearful, and Nora had told him she understood, because she did, and because being gracious about catastrophe was a habit she had built early. Her husband, Marcus, had left 14 months before that. Not in anger, not with violence, just with diminishment. The slow withdrawal of a man who had decided somewhere along the way that the life he had agreed to was not the life he wanted, and who lacked either the courage or the cruelty to say so directly. He simply became less present, then absent on weekends, then gone for a week, then gone entirely, with a text message that said he was sorry, and that he loved the kids, and that he would be in touch. He had sent money twice in the beginning, and then the money stopped, and the contact thinned to nothing. Nora had filed the paperwork herself, late at night at the kitchen table of the apartment they had rented, the apartment she had held on to for 4 more months before the math made it impossible. She did not talk about Marcus to the children. When Cleo asked, Nora said that Daddy was working far away and that he loved them very much, because the first part might be true, and the second part she chose to believe regardless. When Eli asked, which he did less often and with less precision, she said the same thing and held him a little tighter. Children of precarity learned to hold their questions loosely. Cleo had stopped asking as much in the last few months. Nora wasn't sure whether that was resilience or resignation, and she was afraid to examine it too closely. The jobs she had tried since Fenwick's closed, a night shift at a packaging warehouse that ended when the contract was cut, a counter position at a coffee chain that had not worked out in ways she still replayed late at night, 3 weeks of catering work that paid in cash and required a car she could not always guarantee would start, and a brief 2 weeks answering phones for an insurance office before the woman who held the full-time position returned early from maternity leave. Each ending had taken something from her, not just financially, but in some more interior way, a small collapse of the image she held of herself as someone who could manage, who could solve the problem if she worked hard enough and thought clearly enough and kept her chin up and her eyes forward. She was keeping her chin up. She was keeping her eyes forward. She was in room 11 of the Sundown Motor Inn with $62.40 and 14 days before Gerald's goodwill ran out entirely. The phone rang at 9:17 on a Wednesday morning. Nora had sent the children to the motel's small outdoor area, a strip of cracked concrete beside the office where someone had once placed a plastic picnic table, and she was folding laundry from the coin machine in a way that maximized each item's usefulness, which meant examining every garment for structural integrity and making small mental notes about what could be mended and what had passed beyond mending. The number on her phone screen was a Kansas area code she didn't recognize, and her first thought was that it was a creditor, because her first thought about unknown numbers was always that it was a creditor. Am I speaking with Nora Hayes? Previously Nora Driscoll? The voice was older, measured, the voice of someone who delivered information for a living and had learned to do it without effect. That's me. Her maiden name, Driscoll. She had taken Marcus's name when they married and kept it afterward because changing it back seemed like one more administrative catastrophe she didn't have the energy for. My name is Leonard Pruitt. I'm an attorney in Hartwell, Kansas. I'm calling regarding the estate of Raymond Allen Driscoll. I understand he was your mother's uncle, which would make him your great-uncle. Nora set down the shirt she was folding. Raymond Driscoll. She searched her memory and found very little. A name mentioned occasionally at holidays when she was a child. Her mother's dismissive wave when the name came up. He lives out in the middle of nowhere, her mother would say. He's always been strange. He doesn't come to things. The image she retained, if it was a memory, and not a construction, was of a tall man with large hands at some gathering when she was perhaps 7, who had crouched down to her level and asked her, with complete seriousness, what she thought about. Just that. What do you think about? She had been so surprised by the question that she had answered honestly. I think about whether worms have feelings. He had laughed, not the polite adult laugh that meant they weren't really listening, but a real laugh, sudden and genuine. And he had said that was a very important thing to think about. That was the entirety of her relationship with Raymond Allen Driscoll. He passed away 3 weeks ago, Leonard Pruitt continued. He was 81 years old. He had no spouse and no children. He lived alone on his property in Finney County for the last 40 years. A pause. He left a will, Ms. Hayes, a properly executed will, witnessed and notarized, leaving his property in its entirety to you. The shirt was still in her hand. She became aware of it. To me. To you specifically. You're named in the document. There is no ambiguity about intent. Another pause, this one carrying something Nora couldn't quite read. I should tell you that other members of the family have already been in contact with my office, several of them. Your great-uncle's decision was not universally anticipated. What is the property? 12 acres in Finney County, a farmhouse which has fallen into significant disrepair, several outbuildings, and a grain silo. Pruitt's voice remained neutral, professional, but there was something beneath the neutrality. The land itself has limited agricultural value. The buildings will require substantial investment to be made habitable. The silo has been disused for many decades. Nora thought about $62.40. She thought about Gerald and the laminated rate schedule behind the front desk. She thought about Cleo starting 3rd grade and Eli starting kindergarten and the image she had, which she visited sometimes at night because it was too frightening to look at directly in the daytime, of the three of them in her car, with their belongings and garbage bags in the back seat, driving toward no particular destination, because there was no destination. Is there anything in the property I could convert to immediate funds? Pruitt paused in a way that meant he was choosing his words. The land has some residual value as agricultural property, though it's dry and marginal. I would not characterize this as a financially transformative inheritance, Ms. Hayes. I want to be straightforward with you. Most of the family members who contacted me expressed the view that the property represents more of a liability than an asset. Most of the family members. She knew exactly who that meant. Her Aunt Beverly and her three cousins, who had collectively decided decades ago that they were the family's central gravity, and that everyone else existed in varying degrees of orbit around them. Her sister Dana, who lived in Scottsdale and called twice a year, at Thanksgiving and at birthdays, and who had a talent for delivering assessments of other people's choices that sounded like concern, but felt like dismissal. "I'll come see it," Nora said. The silence that followed was brief but perceptible. "Of course. I can make myself available whenever is convenient for you. Though I do want to note, and I say this purely in a spirit of transparency, that the costs associated with maintaining the property, the taxes and any required upkeep, will fall to you as the inheritor. There is no liquid estate to speak of, no bank accounts, no stocks, so Raymond Driscoll lived simply." "I'll still come see it," Nora said. She called Dana from the parking lot, with the children playing within eyesight. She told herself this was because Dana was family, and family should know these things. But she knew, if she was honest with herself, that she was calling because she needed to tell someone, and Dana was the person she reached for in moments of significance, even knowing what she was likely to receive in return. "Raymond left you his property?" Dana's voice had that particular quality, the careful, practiced patience of someone preparing to deliver wisdom. "Nora, you know I love you, but that is not a good thing. Mom always said Raymond was a hoarder. He never fixed anything. The man lived without a working dishwasher for 30 years because he didn't trust contractors. He left it to me," Nora said again. "Not to Beverly, not to anyone else. To me. Because you were kind to him when you were a child, and he never forgot it, probably. Raymond was sentimental underneath all that eccentricity. But sentimentality doesn't pay property taxes, Nora." A pause. "Where are you staying? Are you and the kids okay? Because if you need help, if you need to come to Scottsdale for a few weeks while you figure things out, we're fine. You're staying at a motel. That's what Beverly said." Beverly would have said that. Beverly said everything about everyone. "We're managing. The property is in Finney County. We're going to go see it." "You're going to drive 4 hours to look at a broken-down farm with a grain silo." Dana said this as a statement, not a question. The way you say something when you want the saying of it to do the work of argument. "Yes." Another pause. Then, "Nora, honey, a grain silo in the middle of flat Kansas is not a solution to anything. It's an empty metal cylinder. It's a place where grain used to be. I know what a silo is, Dana. I just don't want you to get your hopes up over nothing." Nora looked at Eli, who was balancing on the edge of the concrete parking stop with his arms out, concentrating with his entire face, the way he concentrated on everything, fully and without reservation. She looked at Cleo, who was sitting at the plastic picnic table drawing something in a notebook, moving the pen with the deliberate pressure of a child who takes drawing seriously. Her children, who deserved a home and a kitchen and a yard and a life that wasn't measured in weekly motel rates. "My hopes aren't up," Nora said, "but there's nothing here to stay for." She told the children that night, after dinner, after they had arranged the small folding table they kept in the room and eaten pasta from the electric kettle, a technique Nora had perfected out of necessity, and which Cleo had declared to be surprisingly good the first time, and now considered normal. She told them they were going on a trip to a place called Hartwell, Kansas, to see a property that a great-great-uncle they had never met had left to them. "What kind of property?" Cleo asked. She was methodical in the way she gathered information, like a small accountant. A farm, with a grain silo." "What's a grain silo?" "A tall tower where farmers store grain, wheat, corn, things like that." Cleo processed this. "Is it our tower now?" "It would be, yes, it would be ours." Eli had been listening with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that interested him, which looked from the outside like stillness, but was actually a kind of intense, internal organizing. "Can we live in the tower?" he asked. Nora had been about to explain that they couldn't, that the silo was for grain, not people, that the farmhouse was the part they would potentially live in. But something stopped her. The question was so earnest and so practical and so free of the embarrassment that adults attach to need. "Can we live in the tower?" "Yes, we need somewhere to live. Here is a tower." "Can we live in it?" The farmhouse," she said. "But the tower is part of it." Eli nodded, satisfied. "Towers are good," he said, with the certainty of someone who had given the matter considerable thought. They left the next morning before 6, before the heat became something to contend with. The car, a 2014 Civic that Nora kept running through a combination of careful attention and determination, had 212,000 miles on it, and a sound from the driver's side that she had learned to live with, the way you learn to live with a neighbor's dog, present and intermittent, and never quite alarming enough to require immediate action. She had packed their things in 2 hours the night before. They did not have much to pack. The drive from Kansas City to Finney County was the kind of drive that reorganized your sense of scale. The city fell away in the rearview mirror and was replaced by suburbs, which gave way to small towns, separated by increasing intervals of open land, which gave way eventually to the plains themselves, the vast, flat, sun-hammered plains of western Kansas that went on and on and on in every direction without offering the eye any particular place to rest. The sky here was enormous, not just large, but actively, assertively enormous, as though it had expanded to fill the absence of anything tall. The wheat fields, harvested now in August, lay in pale stubble that caught the early light and glowed like something just cooled. The grain elevators rose from the horizon at irregular intervals, tall concrete sentinels, the tallest things visible for miles in every direction. Cleo read in the back seat, but Eli slept for the first 2 hours and then woke and sat looking out the window with the receptive, unsurprised attention he brought to landscapes, as though the plains were something he had expected. At some point he asked if there were buffalo, and Nora told him there used to be, millions of them, and he said that was a lot, and was quiet again for a long time, thinking about it. Nora drank gas station coffee and listened to the radio until the signal thinned, and then drove in silence with her thoughts. The attorney had said there was no liquid estate, no money, just the land, the buildings, the silo. She had looked up property values in Finney County the night before, sitting on the edge of the motel bed with the children asleep, and had found numbers that were not alarming, but were not encouraging either. Marginal agricultural land, 12 acres, disused farm infrastructure. She knew, rationally, that this was likely exactly what Leonard Pruitt had described it as: a liability with limited conversion value, a sentimental bequest from a man who had nothing but land and who had given his land to the great niece who had once told him she thought about whether worms had feelings. She knew that. She kept driving anyway. Hartwell was a town of 4,000 people, arranged around a main street that had survived several decades of small-town economic contraction with a kind of dignified stubbornness. There was a diner, a hardware store, a farm supply cooperative, a small library, a bank branch, and several storefronts that had changed their purpose multiple times and now occupied an ambiguous middle ground between active and dormant. The grain elevator at the edge of town was the tallest structure by a significant margin and was visible from the highway 2 miles out, a pale column catching the late morning sun. Leonard Pruitt's office was above the insurance agency on Main Street, accessible by a narrow staircase. He was a compact man in his late 60s, with a white mustache and the kind of unhurried manner that people in small towns sometimes developed, not from lack of urgency, but from long familiarity with what urgency actually accomplished. He shook Nora's hand and crouched briefly to Cleo and Eli's level with the practiced ease of a grandfather, then laid the papers on his desk with the careful ordering of someone who believed that proper documentation was a form of respect. "The title is clean," he said. Once the children had been settled with the books, he kept in a small basket for exactly this purpose. Raymond was scrupulous about that, paid his taxes every year without fail. There are no liens, no encumbrances. The property transfers to you without any legal complications. "What was he like?" Nora asked. "You knew him?" Pruitt considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He came in twice a year, regular as weather. Once to update paperwork, once to check on the will. He talked very little about himself. He was polite. He was clear about what he wanted. A pause. He was not a wasteful man. He didn't have unnecessary things, and he didn't say unnecessary words. Another pause. "He spoke about you specifically. On his last visit, he said he wanted to make sure you were protected. That was his word. Tom, protected. He barely knew me." He said he knew enough. Pruitt looked at her steadily. He was a careful judge of people. In my experience, men who live alone for long periods either lose the ability to read people or they become very good at it. Raymond was the second kind. He drove them to the property himself, which she hadn't expected. He said the road was poorly marked, and she would miss the turn, which was true. But she suspected also that he was curious in the way of someone who had kept a secret long enough to wonder what would happen when it was opened. They followed his truck out of town on the state highway for 6 miles, and then turned onto a county road, and then onto a dirt track that cut through flat fields of stubble and emerged, after 1.5 miles, into a clearing that contained what Raymond Driscoll had left her. Nora stopped the car. She sat for a moment without moving. The farmhouse was to the left, a 2-story structure that had once been white and was now the color of old bone, its paint peeled down to bare wood on the south side, where 40 years of wind and sun had done their work. The porch sagged at one end. 2 of the upstairs windows were covered with plywood, but the walls were vertical, and the roof, though it bore evidence of multiple repairs in different colored patches, appeared to be intact. Beside the house was a shed, still standing, and behind the shed was the ruined frame of what had been a barn, its roof long since collapsed inward, its walls leaning in a permanent attitude of slow surrender. And then there was the silo. It stood to the right of the farmhouse, and separated from it by perhaps 40 yards of hard-packed dirt and summer-dry grass. It was taller than the house by a considerable margin, a cylinder of corrugated steel panels that rose 40 feet from its concrete base to its conical roof. The steel had rusted to a deep reddish brown on its upper third, where moisture had worked over the decades. Below that, the original paint was still partially visible, a faded blue-gray that had once been some specific color and was now simply the color of things left outside for a very long time. It stood with the particular authority of structures that have not moved in decades, rooted and massive, indifferent to the small human concerns that had been playing out around it since it was last filled with grain. Cleo said very quietly, "It's big." Eli said nothing. He was looking at the silo through the car window, with an expression Nora could not read, the expression he sometimes wore when he was deciding something. Leonard Pruitt came to her window. "I know it doesn't look like much," he said, and there was genuine apology in it. "It looks like something," Nora said, which was true, though she couldn't have said yet what. They walked the property in the August heat, the dry grass crackling underfoot. Pruitt pointed out the water well, which was functional, tested the previous year. He showed her the electric meter, which Raymond had maintained in working order. He noted that the farmhouse, while in need of significant cosmetic repair, had a sound foundation and intact exterior walls. He indicated where the septic system was located. He was giving her the practical inventory of a place, the adult checklist, and Nora absorbed it with the portion of her mind that processed logistics, while the rest of her mind was doing something else. Something she couldn't quite name, a kind of slow, tentative orientation toward the possibility that this place could be made into something. The children walked beside her, Cleo making precise observations about the state of the porch boards, in a way that made Nora think she had absorbed more of the anxiety of their situation than she had let on, while Eli drifted gradually, inevitably toward the silo with the patient magnetism of water finding a downhill path. By the time Nora turned around, he was standing directly before it, one small hand pressed flat against the corrugated steel, looking up. "Come back over here, Elle," Nora called. He came, but slowly, and he kept looking back. That afternoon, after Pruitt had returned to town, and Nora had walked through the farmhouse with the flashlight from her car, assessing and cataloging and forcing herself to look at problems clearly rather than away from them, she sat on the porch steps with the children as the sun began its long, western drop. The porch step was solid, she had checked. The house was livable, in the sense that it had walls and a roof and a floor and a functioning kitchen, if you replaced the 2 burners that had burned out, and the faucet that dripped. It was dirty. It smelled of decades of closed rooms. It would take work, sustained and unglamorous work, to become what she needed it to be. But it was theirs. That was the word that kept surfacing. Theirs. Belonging to no landlord, subject to no Gerald, and owing nothing to a lease or a rate schedule or someone else's goodwill. 12 acres of flat Kansas land, and a farmhouse in need of attention, and a grain silo that stood 40 yards away in the late afternoon light, casting a long shadow across the dry grass. She called Dana that evening from the farmhouse porch, while the children ate crackers and peanut butter inside. She described what she'd found: the disrepair, the work needed, the functionality of the basic systems. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're seriously considering this?" "I've already decided." "Nora," the particular Donna sigh, "I love you. I do. But you have 2 children. You can't move them into a condemned farmhouse in the middle of western Kansas. It's not condemned. The structure is sound." The attorney confirmed it. "The attorney is probably glad someone is finally going to pay property taxes on it. What are you going to do out there? There are no jobs in Hartwell. There's no bakery to work at. There's nothing. There's a school. There's a diner that had a help wanted sign in the window. And there is a house, Dana. An actual house that belongs to us that nobody can take away. It's not an asset. It's an obligation. You said yourself it needs work. Where's the money for that coming from?" "I don't know yet. I'll figure it out. That's not a plan. It's better than the plan I had yesterday." The silence that followed had the quality of someone deciding whether to continue arguing or to let the argument go. Donna let it go, partly. "Just be careful," she said finally. "And call me if you need anything." She didn't call Beverly because she knew what Beverly would say, and she didn't have the energy to be managed. Beverly called her 2 days later, having heard from Dana, and the conversation was everything Nora had predicted. Gentle at first, then firmer, then edging into something that was not quite criticism, but was clearly its neighbor. Beverly's 3 children all adults now, had apparently been discussing the situation, and they felt, collectively, that the family should have been consulted before Raymond made his decision, and furthermore, that the property really ought to be handled properly, meaning liquidated for whatever marginal value it carried, and that Nora should take the proceeds, however small, and use them to establish herself somewhere with actual opportunities. Somewhere not rural western Kansas. Nora listened to all of it. She thanked Beverly for her concern. She said she had made her decision. Beverly said she hoped Nora knew what she was doing, with the particular inflection that meant she clearly didn't think Nora knew what she was doing. Nora said goodbye and sat for a while in the farmhouse kitchen with her back against the wall, looking at the ceiling, counting the cracks. She found the envelope on the 4th day. She had been systematically cleaning the farmhouse room by room, working from the top down, which is the way her mother had taught her to clean a house, and which was also the way you established a kind of order over chaos, not solving everything at once, but taking it in sections. The upstairs rooms had yielded a significant quantity of old newspapers, several dozen canning jars, both empty and full, a collection of hand tools that appeared to be in excellent condition despite the neglect of the house itself, and a quantity of general dust and debris that Nora removed by the bucket over 2 days. The children helped where they could, which in Eli's case meant cheerfully carrying things from one place to another, and in Cleo's case, meant methodical sweeping in a specific corner she had designated as her responsibility. The envelope was in the kitchen. She found it behind the lower cabinet, not fallen but placed, with the deliberateness of something put there to be discovered in the course of a thorough cleaning by someone patient enough to pull the cabinets away from the wall. It was sealed with wax, an old-fashioned detail that made Nora pause before opening it, running her thumb over the impression in the wax, which was a simple circle with a line through it, not a signet, just a shape, something pressed there by hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in handwriting she did not know, but recognized immediately as the writing of someone who had thought carefully about each word before committing it. Raymond Driscoll's handwriting was neither ornate nor cramped. It was the handwriting of a practical man who had written many things over many years and had long since resolved the question of what was worth the effort of recording. The letter began without preamble. Nora, I expect you are wondering why I left this to you and not to the others. I want to tell you plainly, because I have spent most of my life being indirect about things, and I no longer see the point. When you were small, perhaps 7 years old, you asked me what I thought about. This was at your grandmother's house, some holiday gathering I cannot now recall precisely. Everyone else was engaged with adult concerns, and you simply walked up to me and asked. Most people, even children, perform conversation. They ask questions they already know the answer to, or questions they don't actually care about. You asked me what I thought about, as though the answer genuinely mattered to you. And when I asked the same of you, you told me about worms, whether worms have feelings, that you wondered about this regularly. I have thought about that conversation many times over the years. It is a small thing, I know, but the willingness to take a strange old man's inner life seriously at age 7, without embarrassment and without motive, is not a small quality. It is the quality I have found rarest and most valuable in a life spent mostly alone. I have not been a person with many possessions, but I have been a person who paid attention to things other people did not think were worth attention. I have been doing this for a very long time, and it has not always been without result. The silo is where I kept what I found most important. I kept it there because it was mine, and because a man who has spent his life watching other people fail to hold on to what matters knows the value of a place no one else has reason to look. There is a door in the base of the silo, not the main access door on the east side, which anyone can see. This one is on the north face, behind the concrete footings, below the grade line. You will need to clear the overgrowth from that side to find it. The door requires the key I have enclosed with this letter. What you find there is yours. It has always been intended for you, or for whoever came after me who was the right person to receive it. I have believed since that holiday that you were that person. Take care of the children. Take care of the house. The land is decent land, if you treat it decently. Raymond Driscoll. The key was taped to the inside of the envelope. A flat, modern key. Nothing old-fashioned about it. The kind of key you would use on a padlock rather than a door, with a number etched into the head. 41. Nora read the letter twice. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light, and she read it twice, and then she sat very still for a moment looking at the window. Outside the window was the yard, the dry grass, the shed, and at the far edge of her sight line, the curved edge of the silo's base. She heard her own heartbeat, not racing exactly, something slower and more deliberate than racing, the beat of a body that is paying close attention. She called the children. The north face of the silo was the side away from the house, the side you would not normally approach because there was no reason to approach it. The overgrowth Pruitt had mentioned was, in fact, a dense tangle of drought-resistant brush that had established itself against the concrete foundation over decades, thorny and tenacious, and reaching in some places to shoulder height. Nora had brought gloves and a short-handled spade from the shed, which had yielded an impressive collection of tools in various states of repair, and she worked methodically along the base of the silo, pulling and cutting and folding back the brush, while the children watched from a distance she had established as the safety perimeter. It took 2 hours. The August heat was serious by 3 in the afternoon, and she took water breaks and made the children drink water even when they said they weren't thirsty. The concrete foundation was substantial, deeper than you might expect, extending perhaps 18 inches below the current grade on this side, where the ground had shifted slightly over the decades, creating a channel along the wall where debris had collected and vegetation had taken hold. And then her spade hit something that was not dirt, or root, or concrete. A sound different from the others. The hollow note of a door. She crouched down and cleared the last of the brush and dirt with her gloved hands. The door was steel. T recessed into the concrete foundation at a slight angle, perhaps 18 inches tall and 24 inches wide. Not a door you would walk through standing up. A door you would access on your hands and knees. Its face was flush with the concrete, and had been there long enough that a thin seam of old caulk, gray with age, ran around its entire perimeter. In its center was a padlock hasp, and in the padlock was a lock, and in her palm was the key. She looked at her children. Cleo was standing very still, with her arms at her sides, her face doing something complex. Eli had moved from the designated safety perimeter to just behind Nora's shoulder, close enough that she could hear him breathing. "Move back a little, Elle," she said, and he moved back the width of one small step. The key went in. It turned with a solidity, a precision of fit, that spoke of regular maintenance. The lock opened. She removed it and set it on the concrete beside her. The door opened outward on a hinge, and she pulled it. It came with resistance, not rust, but weight, and a quality of long closure, the seal of a space that had been closed deliberately and well. And then it was open, and she was looking into darkness. She had the flashlight. She had brought it automatically, the way you brought tools when you were a person who expected to need tools. She clicked it on and leaned into the opening. The chamber was not large, 8 feet across, perhaps. Its ceiling was low, 5 feet at most, and its floor was smooth, poured concrete, clean and dry, in a way that spoke of extraordinary care, given the decades of neglect above ground. The walls were concrete block, thick, the kind of construction that said whoever built this understood that whatever went inside was meant to last. Along the walls were metal shelves, the industrial kind, bolted to the block. And on the shelves, arranged with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 40 years placing things carefully, were objects that the flashlight caught one by one as she swept the beam across them. Boxes. Flat metal boxes, the kind you used for document storage, sealed and labeled in the same handwriting as the letter, each with a date and a description. But between the boxes and beneath them, and along the lowest shelf closest to the floor, were other things. Things that caught the light differently. Things that did not reflect the beam so much as hold it, and absorbing it, and giving it back in a way that metals did when they were very pure and very dense. Nora Hayes, 33 years old, formerly of room 11 of the Sundown Motor Inn, crouched at the entrance of a sealed chamber beneath a rusted grain silo on 12 acres of western Kansas flatland, and looked at what Raymond Driscoll had spent 40 years quietly, carefully, methodically setting aside for her. And she could not move. She could not speak. She could hear her own breathing and the breathing of her son just behind her, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of the wind moving across the plains in its endless, patient way, and nothing else. "Mama," Cleo's voice, very close now, quiet and precise. "What is it?" Nora opened her mouth. She closed it again. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the lowest shelf. She looked at what the flashlight was showing her. She found her voice. It came out smaller than she expected, a voice that had been reduced by wonder to its essential components. "I don't know yet," she said. "I don't know yet, but I think it's going to be all right." Above them, the silo stood in the late afternoon light, 40 feet of rusted steel and memory, rooted in its concrete base, casting its long shadow eastward across the dry Kansas grass. Exactly as it had stood for 60 years. Exactly as Raymond Driscoll had intended it to stand. Waiting for the right person to come, in exactly the right kind of need, with exactly the right willingness to look at a strange old man's inner life and take it seriously. Above them, the enormous Kansas sky held everything without comment, as it always had, as it always would. And in a chamber in the dark beneath their feet, 40 years of patient, careful, deliberate intention waited to become something that a woman and her 2 children would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. Eli pressed closer behind her. His voice was perfectly calm, the voice of a 5-year-old boy for whom the extraordinary had not yet learned to be frightening. "Can we go in the tower now?" Nora almost laughed. She almost cried. She did both, a little, in the same breath, and it was the cleanest feeling she had had in longer than she could accurately remember. She reached back and found his hand in the dark and held it. "Yeah, baby," she said. "I think we can." The first thing Nora established was that the children would not go inside. Not yet. Not until she understood what she was looking at, what the space was structurally, whether the floor held, whether the air was clean. These were the practical considerations, and she held them in the front of her mind deliberately, because the practical considerations were things she could manage, and what she was seeing on those shelves was something she could not yet manage. And so she set it aside in a separate room of her thinking, and closed the door, and focused on what was immediate and controllable. "I need you both to stay out here," she said. "Cleo, you're in charge. Eli, you listen to your sister. I'm going in to look, and I will tell you everything I find." Cleo accepted this with the gravity of someone for whom responsibility was a gift rather than a burden. Eli looked at the opening with the expression of a person exercising considerable restraint. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know. Not long." She went in on her hands and knees through the low entrance, and then stood, carefully, the ceiling clearing her head by perhaps 3 inches. She stood still for a moment and breathed. The air was dry and cool in the particular way of sealed spaces, not stale exactly, but concentrated, carrying the compressed absence of ordinary movement and weather. The flashlight threw sharp shadows from the shelf edges across the concrete floor. She started on the right wall and moved clockwise. She was going to look at everything before she touched anything. This was another thing nursing had taught her, the principle of full assessment before intervention, the discipline of not reacting to the first alarming thing, but completing the picture first. The metal document boxes occupied the upper 2 shelves on 3 of the 4 walls. There were 22 of them. Each was labeled in Raymond's handwriting, a date range, and a brief description. The earliest was dated 1961 to 1968, and labeled simply Field Notes and Correspondence. The most recent was dated 2019 to 2023, and labeled Current Records and Instructions. Between those 2 endpoints were 40 years of organized documentation, from a man who, Leonard Pruitt had said, was not wasteful with words. The lower shelves were different. On the lowest shelf of the right wall, arranged in careful rows, were gold coins. American coins, she could see that much, each one in a small, clear holder of the kind used by collectors, each holder labeled with a sticker in handwriting too small to read without leaning close. She counted the holders in the first row. 14. She counted the rows. 6 rows on this section of shelf alone, and the shelf ran the full length of the wall. She moved to the back wall. Here, the lower shelf held something different, rectangular metal bars, each approximately the size of a paperback book, stacked flat in pairs with thin cloth between them. They were the color of very old butter, deep and dense and matte, in a way that absorbed light rather than reflecting it sharply. She counted 16 bars on this shelf. She looked at the nearest one. Stamped into its face was a number, a weight designation, and a purity mark. She did not yet allow herself to calculate what she was looking at. She noted it and moved on. The left wall's lower shelf held what appeared to be paper items, but protected in a way that spoke of extreme care. Flat archival sleeves of the kind used in museum storage, each one sealed and labeled. She could see through the transparent front of the nearest sleeve to the document within, which appeared to be a certificate of some kind, printed in a style that suggested significant age. Beneath the sleeves were several small wooden cases, of the kind used for stamp collections, stacked in 2 piles. She went back to the entrance. She sat on the concrete floor just inside the door, with her knees up and the flashlight in her lap, and she looked at the room. Raymond Driscoll had spent 40 years building this. Not quickly, not with a windfall, but the way a person built anything of real value, slowly and deliberately, one decision at a time, and with patience that most people never found, because they were always looking for the quick thing, the sudden solution, the transformation that arrived all at once. He had built this the way a craftsman built something, by showing up every day and adding to it, and protecting what was there, and keeping his eyes open and his judgment clear. And then he had sealed it, and put a key in an envelope, and hidden the envelope, where only a person who cleaned a house the right way, all the way down to pulling the cabinets from the wall, would ever find it. What you find there is yours. It has always been intended for you, or for whoever came after me who was the right person to receive it. She thought about the worm conversation. When she was 33 years old, and she had been through the particular series of collapses that left a person in a motel room with $62, trying to calculate whether 3 people could eat adequately on $62 for 2 weeks. And she had been, through all of it, the person who showed up and did the work and kept the practical mind engaged, and the larger fear managed, and the children fed, and the 40 seconds of morning quiet inviolate. She thought about Raymond Driscoll living alone on this land for 40 years, paying careful attention to things other people did not think were worth attention. She thought about the holiday gathering where a 7-year-old girl had walked up to a strange old man and asked him what he thought about, not because she was performing conversation, but because she genuinely wanted to know, because other people's inner lives were interesting to her, and she had not yet learned to be embarrassed about that. She sat in the dry, cool dark of the chamber and let the feeling move through her. Not triumphant, not exactly. Something with more weight than triumph. Something that felt like being caught after a long fall, the sudden solid ground, the breath. Then she got up because there was work to do. She took photographs first, systematic and thorough, the way she had photographed the farmhouse's structural problems on the first day, moving around the room in a grid pattern and capturing everything at close range. The document boxes with their labels, the coin holders with their contents and their labels, the bullion bars, the archival sleeves, the stamp cases. Everything documented in sequence, backed up immediately to the cloud with the brief data service she was getting from the nearest cell tower, which was in Hartwell, and which delivered a signal that was adequate, but not generous. Then she brought the children in. She brought them in because they were her children, and because what happened next would happen to all of them, and because Eli had been exercising restraint for the better part of an hour, and that was already asking a significant amount of a 5-year-old, and because Cleo had the right to know what her family's life was about to become. They went in on their hands and knees through the low door and stood in the chamber and looked. Cleo stood very still with the flashlight Nora had given her, sweeping it slowly across the shelves the way Nora had shown her, methodical and careful. She said nothing for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of a person who has assembled a great deal of information and is now proceeding to conclusions with caution. "Are those gold?" she asked, indicating the coin holders on the right wall. "I believe so." "And those?" "The bars on the back wall. Also, I believe gold." Cleo absorbed this. "Like a lot of gold?" "I'm going to need help understanding exactly how much. We'll need to talk to some people." Another long pause. Cleo swept the flashlight over the archival sleeves on the left wall. "What about those?" "Documents and stamps, I think. Collectible stamps, maybe." Cleo lowered the flashlight and looked at Nora in the reflected light. "Are we going to be okay now, Mama?" It was the simplest version of the question, the core of everything. Nora looked at her daughter, 8 years old, who had been carrying the weight of their situation in the careful, watchful way of children who absorbed adult worry and processed it in private because they didn't want to add to the burden. "Yes," Nora said. "We are going to be okay now." Eli, who had been conducting his own inspection of the lowest shelf on the right wall by the simple method of pressing his face very close to the coin holders and looking directly at each one in turn, straightened up and turned around. His expression was one of profound satisfaction. "I knew the tower was good," he said. They slept in the farmhouse that night, the 3 of them on the inflatable mattress Nora kept in the back of the car, which she had used twice at the sundown motor inn, when the children's bed was needed for other purposes. She made the chamber secure with the padlock. I obscured the entry again with as much of the brush as she could push back into place, and walked back to the house in the last of the evening light, trying to think clearly about what the next morning needed to look like. She called Leonard Pruitt from the porch after the children were asleep. He answered on the second ring with the readiness of someone who had been expecting her call. "I found the chamber," she said. "The one in the silo base." A silence that was not surprised. "I see." "You knew?" "I knew Raymond had something there. He told me in general terms on his last visit. He said there was property in the silo base that was not conventional, and that I should not go looking for it myself, and that whoever inherited the land would find it in due course, if they were the right kind of person. Pruitt paused. He was very specific about that. The right kind of person. He seemed entirely confident you would be. I need to talk to someone who understands what I found. An appraiser, I think. Possibly more than one. What did you find, if I may ask? Nora looked at the silo standing in the darkness across the yard, its rusted body barely visible against the star-crowded sky. Gold coins and bullion bars, and what looks like a significant collection of paper items, documents and stamps in archival preservation. I have photographs. Pruitt was quiet for a moment that contained, she thought, a rearrangement of his assumptions about the scope of the morning's inheritance. There is an estate attorney in Wichita I would recommend for situations involving significant assets, he said. Her name is Clara Osei. She handles exactly this kind of work. And she is thorough, and she is honest, and those two qualities are rarer in combination than they should be. Can I contact her tomorrow? I'll call her tonight, Pruitt said, with a decision that meant he was already calculating. I'll let her know the situation in general terms. She'll be ready for you in the morning. Clara Osei arrived at the property at 10 the following morning in a dark blue sedan, having driven from Wichita, a drive of nearly 3 hours, which told Nora something about how Leonard Pruitt had characterized the situation in his call the previous evening. She was 45, compact and precise in her movements, with close-cropped hair and the kind of focus that didn't scatter, and that stayed on the subject in front of her with the patience of someone who had trained themselves to finish each thing before beginning the next. She brought a young associate named David, who carried a case of archival materials and a tablet, and who said very little but observed everything. Nora showed them the chamber. Clara went in with a flashlight and stayed for 20 minutes while David waited outside with the children. When she came out, her face was controlled, but the control was working slightly harder than it had been on the way in. I want to be careful about assessing this myself, Clara said. What I can tell you is that the quantity of material here is substantial, and based on my preliminary look, it appears to be well preserved and potentially significant. I'm going to make some calls this morning, and I am going to ask you not to remove anything from the chamber and not to discuss what you've found with family members until we have a clearer picture. Is that agreeable to you? Yes. I mean everyone, Clara said, with emphasis that suggested she had managed situations in which the word everyone had been interpreted flexibly. Family, friends, anyone. The value of what's here cannot be accurately represented until it's been properly assessed, and misrepresentation before that point creates legal complications that benefit no one. I understand. Clara made her calls from the farmhouse porch. Nora could hear the professional shorthand of someone navigating networks, the dropped names and quick descriptions, and the particular cadence of calls that needed to happen in a specific order, because the person at the end of the chain would not take the call until the person at the middle of the chain had vouched for it. She was on the phone for 2 hours. David sat at the kitchen table with Eli and helped him build a small construction from the set of wooden blocks Nora kept in the car, doing it with the unhurried concentration of a young man who was comfortable with children, which Nora noted because she noted people who were comfortable with her children without performing comfort. By noon, Clara had 4 commitments. 2 numismatists, specialists in coins and currency, who would arrive from Kansas City the following day. A precious metals assayer from a firm in Denver who would arrive the day after, and a rare documents and philatelic specialist named Professor Harold Ewan from the University of Kansas, who would arrive at the end of the week. This will take several days, Clara told Nora. Proper assessment cannot be rushed without compromising accuracy, and we need accuracy. Do you have somewhere to stay? We're staying here. The farmhouse is livable. Clara looked at the farmhouse with the careful neutrality of someone who had different private standards. All right. I'll arrange for a security assessment as well. The chamber should be observed overnight until we have a complete inventory. Nora looked at her. You think someone will come? I think that when valuable things are found in places that have been neglected for a long time, it is good practice to behave as though the wrong people might find out before the right protections are in place. Clara said this with the matter-of-fact tone of a person who had learned lessons from experience. It may be unnecessary. It's better to be unnecessary than insufficient. The security was a man named Gary from a private firm in Dodge City, 63. Quiet, a former county sheriff's deputy who sat in his truck outside the chamber entrance through the nights with a thermos and a paperback and called into Clara's service every hour. His presence was both practical and oddly comforting. Another adult in the compound, another pair of eyes. The numismatists arrived the following afternoon. Their names were Patricia Holt and James Chen. Patricia was in her 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses worn on a chain, the kind of person whose expertise had made them both precise and gentle, because a lifetime of handling fragile things made you careful in all directions. James was 40, quieter than Patricia, who did most of the talking, and who had the particular intensity of a person who genuinely loved their subject. They worked in the chamber for 6 hours the first day, emerging at intervals to consult with each other in low voices and to record findings on Patricia's tablet, which she held at the particular angle of someone protecting proprietary assessment data. Nora watched them from the kitchen window and tried not to project meaning onto their expressions, and mostly failed. At the end of the first day, Patricia sat at the kitchen table with Nora and Clara and opened her tablet. So I want to preface this by saying that these are preliminary findings, subject to full documentation and verification, she said, with the careful introduction of someone managing expectations in both directions. That said, I want you to have a working picture. Please, Nora said. Patricia adjusted her glasses. The coin collection. What you have in those holders represents a careful accumulation over multiple decades. The earliest pieces are Morgan silver dollars from the late 19th century. The most significant group is a set of St. Gaudens double eagle gold coins in very high grades, which is to say in excellent condition. There are also several key date pieces, coins that were minted in small numbers and are extremely sought after by collectors. The scope of what's here, in terms of numismatic value, which is collector value as opposed to raw metal value, is considerable. How considerable? Clara asked, calmly. Patricia looked at her tablet and then at Nora. Preliminary assessment of the coin collection alone, accounting for condition grades and current market, is in the range of $14 to $18 million. Nora's hands were flat on the kitchen table. She kept them flat on the kitchen table. She had been preparing herself for a number that would change things. She had thought she was prepared. The number reached her, and she felt it not in her head, but in her sternum, a physical impact, like the moment after a fall when the breath returns and you understand what could have happened. $14 to $18 million, pour in coin holders. On a shelf in a concrete chamber in the base of a rusted grain silo on 12 acres of flat Kansas land. The bullion bars, Clara said. Patricia nodded. James is still working through the full catalog on those. Based on what we've documented today, you're looking at between 400 and 440 troy ounces of gold bullion across those bars. At current spot price, that's approximately $850,000 to $900,000 in raw metal value, not accounting for any numismatic premium on specific castings. Nora said nothing. She was looking at the table. The paper holdings we haven't assessed yet, Patricia continued. Professor Ewan will be better positioned than we are to value those, but I can tell you that the preservation quality is extraordinary. Those archival sleeves are professional grade, and the storage conditions in that chamber, the temperature, the dryness, the darkness are ideal. Whatever is in there has been exceptionally well maintained. Nora looked up. He spent 40 years doing this, she said. It wasn't a question. It was the recognition of a fact that was settling into her understanding of Raymond Driscoll, of the man who had lived alone on this land and paid careful attention to things other people did not think were worth attention. He built it piece by piece. Patricia nodded. The accumulation pattern we can see in the dates and provenance of these coins is consistent with someone who was buying strategically and incrementally over a long period. Not all at once. Not with sudden wealth. He knew what he was looking for, and he was patient. James spoke from the doorway where he had been listening. He was a very sophisticated collector. Some of these pieces, you don't find them by accident. You have to know they exist, know where to look, build relationships with dealers and auction houses over years. The man understood what he was doing. That night, after Clara and the numismatists had returned to the motel in Hartwell, after Gary had taken up his position outside, Nora sat on the porch steps in the dark for a long time. The children were asleep inside. The silo stood in the starlight, exactly as it had always stood. She looked at it and tried to understand what Raymond Driscoll had intended when he built that chamber, what he had believed about the future, about her, about the nature of good fortune, and whether it could be directed. Most of the family members who contacted me expressed the view that the property represents more of a liability than an asset. She thought about Beverly. She thought about Dana. She thought about the voice that said a grain silo in the middle of flat Kansas is not a solution to anything. She didn't feel anger. She wanted to feel something clean and vindicating. But what she actually felt was more complicated, more tired, something adjacent to sadness. Because Beverly and Dana and the cousins had all looked at the same thing she had looked at and had seen only its surface. They had seen the rusted steel and the overgrown foundation and the sagging porch and had declared it worthless without asking what might be worth paying attention to underneath. And that was a kind of poverty that had nothing to do with money, a poverty of attention, a poverty of patience, a poverty of the willingness to take strange things seriously and find out what they were before deciding what they weren't. Raymond had known this about them, she thought. That was why he hadn't left it to them. Professor Harold Ewan arrived on Friday morning. He was 68 years old, a philatelist and rare document specialist who had spent 35 years at the University of Kansas and who was known, Clara had told her, as one of the 10 most authoritative voices in North America on 19th and early 20th century American philatelic material. He was a small man with a neat beard and an extraordinary quality of stillness when he was examining something, such a quality of complete absorption that made the rest of the world seem slightly less real while he was engaged with the material in front of him. He worked in the chamber for 2 full days. He took the archival sleeves out one by one, examined each under a magnifying loupe he wore on a headband, replaced them in precise order, photographed each item with a specialized camera David had carried in, and maintained a running verbal record into a small device he held in his left hand. He did not discuss his findings until he was finished with the complete inventory. On Sunday afternoon, he sat across from Nora and Clara at the kitchen table, with the particular composure of a man who was about to deliver news that would require a calibrated response. "I have to begin by saying," he said, "that in 35 years of work in this field, I have not seen an accumulation of this scope and quality in private hands. That is not the hyperbole of a dealer trying to generate excitement. It is an accurate statement of fact." He opened his notes and went through the findings methodically. The stamp collection occupied 5 of the wooden cases and the bulk of the archival sleeves. It contained, among other things, a block of 4 of the 1918 24-cent airmail stamp, known as the inverted Jenny, one of the most sought-after errors in American philatelic history, each stamp from the block in condition that Professor Ewan described as exceptional. It contained multiple examples of the 1867 Z grill stamp, of which fewer than 2 are known in public collections. It contained a full set of the 1869 pictorial issue in unused condition, extremely rare to find complete. It contained dozens of other significant items accumulated across the full range of 19th and early 20th century. American postal history. The document holdings included several items of historical significance that Professor Ewan documented with particular care. A signed letter from a 19th century president, 2 original land grant documents from the 1880s, and a collection of railway correspondence from the 1890s that he described as historically noteworthy, independent of its financial value. Total estimated value of the philatelic collection, Professor Ewan said, is, in my assessment, between $260 million and $295 million, with specific items subject to individual auction results that could exceed the high estimate. The kitchen was very quiet, and Clara wrote the number on her legal pad. She wrote it out in full, not numerals, so there was no ambiguity about the zeros. 260 million. She turned the pad so Nora could see it clearly. Nora looked at the number. She looked at it for a long time. $260 million. In flat archival sleeves on metal shelves in a concrete chamber in the base of a grain silo on 12 acres of marginal agricultural land in Finney County, Kansas. Placed there, piece by piece, by a quiet, careful man who had spent 40 years paying attention to things other people did not think were worth attention. He knew, Nora said. Her voice was level. She was surprised by its levelness. He knew what was here. The whole time. He knew exactly, Professor Ewan said quietly. The organization of those materials, the preservation protocols, the sequencing of the collection, this was not accidental accumulation. This was deliberate and sophisticated construction over many decades. He understood the value of every piece in that room. Clara leaned forward. Nora, I need you to hear what I'm about to say clearly. Nora looked at her. The total value of what is in that chamber, the coins, the bullion, and the philatelic collection, is somewhere in the range of $275 million to $314 million. That is the preliminary estimate before individual auction results. It is possible the high end will be exceeded. She paused to let that settle. This changes your situation materially. It also introduces a set of considerations that we need to address immediately before any information becomes public. What kind of considerations? Legal, or tax, security, family. Clara said each word with equal weight, the weight of someone who had navigated all 4 categories in difficult situations before. The legal question is cleanest. You inherited the property, and everything on it, or in it, through a properly executed and witnessed will. The philatelic and numismatic holdings are personal property, legally yours as contents of the inherited estate. There is no meaningful challenge to your ownership. But there will be challenges. There will be challenges, Clara confirmed. When an inheritance of this scale becomes known, there are always challenges. Some will be legal, from family members claiming the will was improperly executed, or that Raymond lacked capacity, or that some portion of the holdings should revert to the broader estate. Some will be practical, not from people who want a piece of what you have. And some will be emotional, from people who are genuinely hurt and genuinely confused about why Raymond did what he did. Nora thought about Dana, about Beverly, about the cousins who had grown up believing this land was theirs in some ambient, undefined way, and who would now have to reckon with the fact that it was not. The tax question, Clara continued, is complex and requires specialized counsel, which I am arranging. Kansas inheritance tax and federal estate tax will each take a portion of the value. With proper planning, we can structure the asset realization in a way that minimizes the total tax burden within the law. This is legitimate and standard practice, a naughty evasion. How long until we know the full picture? The auction process for the significant philatelic pieces takes time. Some items should go to specialized auctions where the right buyers will be present. This is not a process that can or should be rushed. The bullion and the less exceptional numismatic pieces can be liquidated more quickly. But for the top holdings, the inverted Jenny block, the Z grill examples, those are items that require the right venue and the right preparation. How long? To begin realizing meaningful funds from the collection, 3 to 4 months, with the major auction results potentially coming 6 to 12 months out. Clara looked at her steadily. In the interim, I can arrange a secured advance against the assessed value to give you working capital. Now you will not be without resources while the formal process proceeds. Nora thought about the motel, about Gerald, about $62.40. Those numbers seemed now to belong to a different world, a world that still existed and to which she could feel herself connected, which was important, which she was not going to allow herself to forget, because the distance between those numbers and these numbers was real and enormous, and she was going to hold it in her memory and not let the enormity of the present make the smallness of the past abstract. I want to stay here, she said. I want to fix the house. I want the children in school in Hartwell by September. Clara nodded. That's all possible. I want the chamber documented completely before anything moves. I want to understand every single thing that's in there and why Raymond had it and where it came from. Also possible and advisable. And I want to understand what he wanted done with it, beyond leaving it to me. He must have had thoughts about what it was for. Clara reached into her case and withdrew a second envelope, smaller than the one behind the cabinet, which Leonard Pruitt had given her the day before. He did, in fact, she said. Leonard found this in Raymond's files, filed under Letter for After. It was attached to a note specifying that it should be given to you after assessment was complete. Nora took the envelope. It had the same wax seal as the first, the same circle with a line through it. She opened it at the table with Clara and Professor Ewan present, because she understood now that Raymond's intentions were not private in the sense of being only for her. They were private in the sense of being carefully chosen, and there was a difference. The letter was longer than the first. Nora. By the time you read this, you will know what is in the silo, and you will have some understanding of how it got there. I want to explain the rest. I was not born with money. I was born with attention. My father taught me, by example rather than instruction, that the things other people overlook are often the things with the most to offer, because the things other people overlook haven't been bid up to their real value yet. He was talking about soil, mostly. He was a farmer, and he was talking about soil composition and the land other people dismissed as marginal because they hadn't looked at it carefully enough. But the principle generalized. I started collecting stamps when I was 14 years old because a neighbor was throwing away a box of old envelopes, and I thought there might be something worth looking at. There was. By the time I was 20, I had learned enough to be systematic about it. I spent the next 60 years being systematic. The coins came later, in my 30s, when I began to understand that the principles were the same. You looked where other people weren't looking. You were patient. You were accurate. You did not confuse what something cost with what it was worth. I lived simply because I preferred simplicity, not because I lacked means. The land was paid for. The property taxes were manageable. I needed very little. What I accumulated because I found it interesting and because I believed that objects of genuine rarity and historical significance deserve to be preserved, not scattered, not traded for marginal profit, but held together and kept safe until the right time and the right person. I want to say something about what I hope you will do with what I've left. Not instructions. I do not have the right to instruct you, and you are an adult who has managed harder things than sudden wealth. But hopes, yes. The collection has value because it is coherent, because the people who built it, the craftsmen who printed those stamps, the women and men who designed them, the postal workers who carried the mail, the collectors who preserved the pieces over generations, were all part of something continuous. I would ask you to consider, before liquidating everything, what of that continuity is worth preserving. The land is good land. It has been waiting for someone to work it properly. I was not that person. I let the fields go to stubble because my attention was elsewhere. You may be that person, or you may not be. That is for you to determine. There is a family in Hartwell named Solis, Nilda and her son Marco. They have farmed adjacent land for 15 years and have done it well with very limited resources. They are honest people. If you decide to work the land, they are worth knowing. The rest is yours to decide. You will decide well. I have believed that since you were 7 years old. Take care of yourself. Take care of the children. The world is better when people who think about worms have the resources to act on their thinking. Raymond. Nora folded the letter and held it in her hands for a moment. Professor Ewan was looking at the table with the expression of someone receiving something private at a respectful distance. Clara was writing in her legal pad. Outside, through the kitchen window, the silo stood exactly where it had always stood, and the August plains extended in every direction under an enormous, indifferent sky, and the dry grass moved in a wind that did not know or care what had just been found and what was about to begin. The first call was from Dana, that same evening, which meant that Leonard Pruitt had been more forthcoming with the Driscoll family network than Nora had hoped. "I heard something," Dana said, which meant she had heard something specific and was performing the knowledge as a general thing to see what Nora would give. "From Beverly. She said there's been quite a bit of activity at the property." "There has been, yes." "Appraisers?" "That's what Beverly said. Multiple appraisers." "Yes." A pause that contained recalibration. "Nora, I think we need to talk about this as a family. What Raymond left there, whatever it is, it came from the family's land. It has some connection to all of us." Nora thought about Clara's advice, about the legal question and the challenge question and the emotional question. She thought about how to be honest without being careless. "What Raymond left is mine," she said. "His will is clear and has been reviewed by 2 attorneys. He made a decision, and he had every right to make it. I'm not disputing the will." Dana's voice had the quality of someone who was, in fact, considering disputing the will. "I'm just saying that whatever he had accumulated there, some of that, may have involved the family property in some larger sense, and maybe there's a conversation worth having. If you have a legal claim, you should have Clara Osei reviewed by your own attorney and bring it to her." A longer pause. "Clara Osei is your attorney?" "Yes." "Nora, I'm your sister. I'm not calling to fight. I know that." She kept her voice even, kept the warmth in it that was genuinely there, because Dana was her sister, and she did not want this to become a permanent rupture. "I'm not fighting either. But I need to do this the right way, and on the timeline that's right, and right now that means I can't have this conversation. When there's something concrete to discuss, I will call you." Beverly's call came the following morning, earlier than was polite, which was Beverly's way of communicating urgency through social convention. Beverly said several things, with the smooth, practiced cadence of a woman who had been preparing her remarks and who believed that the right words delivered confidently could reorganize reality. She said that Raymond had always been eccentric, possibly not fully competent at the end. She said that the family had a legitimate interest in whatever the property contained, given its long connection to the Driscoll family history. She said that she was not making accusations, only that she felt there should be transparency, which was the word people used when they meant they wanted access to something they did not legally possess. Nora listened to all of it. When Beverly finished, she said, "I'll pass your concerns to my attorney." There was a sharp intake of breath. "Your attorney?" "Yes. Nora, we are family. We don't bring lawyers into family." "Families bring lawyers into things when things are legally significant," Nora said. "This is legally significant. Clara Osei's number is in Wichita. She is very good, and she will be happy to discuss any legitimate concerns you have." Beverly said several more things. Nora listened to them and thanked her for her call and said goodbye. She sat for a moment after the call ended, feeling the precise quality of the pressure Beverly applied, which was the pressure of implied obligation, but the weight of being told that what was legally yours was morally complicated because family, because connection, because the right of people who had never paid attention to something to benefit from someone else's attention. She did not give in to it. She noted it, acknowledged it to herself as real pressure with real emotional content, and then she set it aside in the room in her mind, with the door closed, the same room where she had put the magnitude of the discovery, while she took photographs and assessed the structural integrity of the floor. Then she went and found her children and took them to Hartwell for lunch. The diner on Main Street was called Garza's, which was different from the help wanted sign she had seen in the window of a different establishment on her first day in town, but which also had a help wanted sign, to hand lettered on a piece of cardboard taped inside the door. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 55, stout and efficient in her movements, with the kind of face that had been shaped by years of early mornings and the management of a constant procession of other people's requirements. Her name was Rosie Garza. She had owned the diner for 23 years. She had known Raymond Driscoll. "He came in every Tuesday," she said, setting coffee in front of Nora without being asked, the way you set coffee in front of someone who looked like they needed it. Never ordered anything different. Scrambled eggs and wheat toast. Coffee, black. Sat at the same stool at the counter every time. She paused in the particular way of people remembering the recently dead. Quiet man, but not unfriendly. The kind of quiet that was about something going on inside rather than not having anything to say. "He was my great-uncle," Nora said. "He left me his property." Rosie looked at her for a moment, the slow, comprehensive look of someone taking a new thing in. "So you're the one." She said it as though this was a known category, a slot that had always existed and was now being filled. "Did he talk about me?" "Not by name. He said once, about 3 years ago, that he had figured out who the property should go to, and that he felt settled about it." Rosie refilled her coffee, though it barely needed refilling, the gesture of someone who wanted a reason to stay at the conversation. "He said she was a person who paid attention to things. I asked what things, and he said everything, which is a good answer." Cleo was eating a grilled cheese with the focused satisfaction of a child experiencing a significant improvement in lunch quality over recent weeks. Eli had already finished his and was drawing on the paper placemat with a crayon the server had brought without being asked, which was a small kindness that Nora noted. "I saw the sign," Nora said. "The help wanted." Rosie looked at her steadily. "You're a woman who just inherited a significant piece of property, and you want to ask about a diner job. I worked in a bakery for 6 years. I know commercial kitchens. I'm going to be here, and I'd like to be useful while the estate situation gets sorted out. And I'd like to know people. A pause that had the quality of a decision being made. "Can you open at 5:30? "Yes." "Kitchen opens at 6. I need someone who knows what they're doing and doesn't take 3 weeks to learn the equipment." "I'm a fast learner," Rosie nodded slowly. "Come in Monday, 6 a.m. We'll see." They walked out of Garza's into the Hartwell main street, the flat, bright Kansas midday pressing down on the wide, quiet street. And Nora Hayes, who 3 weeks ago had been in room 11 of the Sundown Motor Inn with $62.40, stood on the sidewalk with her children and felt something she was going to have to work to name accurately. It was not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. It was not vindication, though vindication was part of it too. It was closer to the feeling she had had in the chamber when she had sat on the concrete floor and looked at the shelves and understood that Raymond Driscoll had built something, and piece by piece, over a lifetime, and had given it to her because she was 7 years old once, and took a strange man's inner life seriously without embarrassment and without motive. It was the feeling of being seen. Across decades, across distance, across everything that had happened between that holiday gathering and this August morning on a Hartwell sidewalk. Seen and considered and trusted. And then there was the other thing, the thing she had been holding at a careful distance because it was the largest and required the most steady handling. $275 million. The full range. Everything documented and assessed, and waiting in a concrete chamber in the base of a rusted silo on 12 acres of land that were hers. She looked at Eli, who was walking beside her with 1 foot deliberately on and 1 foot deliberately off the sidewalk curb in a pattern that required all of his concentration. She looked at Cleo, who was looking at the window of the hardware store with the appraising eye of a child who had recently been thinking about things like porch boards and window frames. "Hey," Nora said. They both looked at her. "I want you to know something. What we found in the silo, it's going to take a while to understand what it all means. It's going to be complicated for a while, and there will be people who are not happy about it. But we're going to be okay. We're going to be more than okay." Cleo studied her with the serious attention that was her primary mode of engagement with important things. "How much more than okay?" Nora almost laughed, but the specificity of the question was so precisely Cleo. "A lot more," she said. "I promise." Eli had stopped walking. He looked up at her with his direct, uncomplicated gaze. "Are we going to stay in the house with the tower?" "Yes, baby. We're going to stay." He nodded. This was enough. He went back to his sidewalk curb pattern, and they walked the length of Hartwell's main street in the August heat. 3 people who had found a home in the most improbable of places, in the base of a rusted grain silo on the flat Kansas plains, built there piece by piece by a quiet man who believed that attention was the rarest form of value, and that the right person would always find it if you left a clear enough path. In the diner behind them, Rosie Garza was already telling the other Tuesday regular that Raymond's family had come, finally, and that she thought they were going to stay. And in the chamber in the silo's base, the inverted Jenny block and the Z grill stamps and the Bullion bars and the gold coins lay in their archival sleeves and their precise holders in the cool dark, exactly as Raymond had placed them, patient as they had always been, waiting for the work of transformation to begin. But the work of transformation, as Nora was about to discover, did not only run in one direction. It was not only about the money finding its way into the right hands. It was also about the forces that moved toward money when it appeared in unexpected places, the people who believed they had a claim, and the people who simply wanted a share, and the people who were prepared to pursue both through whatever means were available to them. Beverly filed the first legal challenge 8 days after Nora's discovery became known to the family. Her attorney, a man named Clifton Price from Kansas City, who specialized in will contests, submitted a petition to the Finney County Probate Court, alleging that Raymond Driscoll, at the time of executing his will, had been suffering from diminished cognitive capacity, rendering the will invalid. The petition cited Raymond's age, his isolation, and the unusual nature of his bequest as circumstantial evidence of incapacity. Clara received the filing on a Thursday morning and called Nora immediately. "This is expected," she said. "The cognitive capacity challenge is the standard opening move in a contested inheritance because it requires only an allegation, not evidence, to initiate proceedings. Our response will be straightforward. Our Raymond revised this will twice in the last 5 years, each time in Leonard Pruitt's office, each time before a notary and 2 independent witnesses. Leonard can testify to his clear and organized state of mind at each meeting. His bank records show consistent, methodical financial management until weeks before his death. We will counter-petition for dismissal, and I expect to succeed." "How long?" "Months, potentially. Probate proceedings take time. But I want to be clear. The challenge does not affect your possession of the property or the contents. You own them now. The challenge is an attempt to reverse that through the courts. It's unlikely to succeed, but it will require time and legal resources to defeat. What does it cost? My fees, which will come from the estate as is standard in Kansas. You will not pay out of pocket." Raymond left instructions with Leonard specifically anticipating a legal challenge, and the estate has a small liquid component designated for defense of the will. Nora thought about Raymond anticipating this, building that defense into the instructions the way he built the preservation protocols into the chamber. One more piece of careful preparation from a man who thought several moves ahead. "What about Beverly? Does she know what's in the collection?" "The petition references valuable assets of unknown scope, which suggests she knows something is there, but not the full picture. My strong recommendation is that the specific valuations remain confidential until the probate challenge is resolved. Not disclosing the full value before the legal situation is settled creates pressure that benefits the challenging party." 2 days after the legal petition, a man named Curtis Hale appeared at the property. He arrived in a large truck, unannounced, and walked toward the farmhouse with the purposeful ease of someone who had decided that ease was the best strategy. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of a man who operated in spaces where being larger than other people had historically worked in his favor. He said he was a private buyer, a collector, and that he had heard through the philatelic community that a significant collection had been discovered in Finney County. He said he could offer immediate cash for the entire contents of the chamber, no appraisal required, no delays. He named a number: $40 million. Nora stood in the farmhouse doorway and looked at him. She thought about Patricia Holt's preliminary assessment: 14 to 18 million for the coins alone. Professor Ewan's 260 to 295 million for the stamps, 40 million for everything. "You'd need to talk to my attorney," she said. "Clara Osei, in Wichita." "I'd rather talk to you directly," he said, with the smile of someone who had found that direct conversations with people who were new to significant wealth were often more productive than conversations with their attorneys. "I'm sure you would," Nora said. "Her number is in Wichita. Have a good day." She closed the door. Gary, who had been watching from beside his truck, walked over after Curtis Hale had driven away. "I'd like to run that plate," he said. "Please do," Nora said. The plate came back registered to a shell company, which Clara's subsequent inquiry connected to a consortium of 3 private collectors, with a documented pattern of approaching newly discovered collections before valuation was complete, and making offers designed to capitalize on the discoverers' unfamiliarity with their holdings' true scope. Not illegal, but not, as Clara put it, acting in anyone's interest but their own. And then there was the call from the local news station in Dodge City, who had heard something from someone in Hartwell's small, active network of people who knew everything, and who wanted to send a crew for an interview about the remarkable discovery in the grain silo. Clara said no. Not yet. Not until the legal position was secured and the valuation was complete, and Nora had had time to decide what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it. Nora agreed. There was a version of this story that belonged to the world, eventually, because Raymond's collection was historically significant, and because the story of how it was found and why it was left to her was a story worth telling. But it needed to be told on her terms, at the right time, in the right way. Raymond had been patient for 40 years. She could be patient for a few more months. She started work at Garza's on Monday morning at 5:30. She was not there because she needed the money. She was there because she had told Rosie she would be, and because she was a person who showed up for things she said she would show up for, and because she had been a woman who worked in a kitchen for 6 years, and she intended to remain a person who worked, because the $62.40 was not a distant memory she wanted to let go of. It was a true thing that had happened, and she was going to carry it, as the true things that happen to you should be carried, not as shame, but as information, as the particular clarity that comes from knowing exactly what it feels like to have nothing. Rosie watched her in the kitchen on that first Monday morning with the careful attention of someone whose opinion was worth having. At the end of the shift, she said, "You're good. Come back Wednesday." She came back Wednesday. She came back Friday. She learned the regulars by their orders before she learned their names, which was the way of diners. And she found that she was happy there in the particular way of someone whose hands know what to do, and for whom the uncomplicated satisfaction of work done well was not a small thing. One Tuesday morning, 5 weeks after she had arrived in Hartwell, a woman named Nilda Solis came into Garza's and sat at the counter. She was perhaps 60, weathered and direct, with the economy of movement of someone who did not waste herself. She ordered coffee and wheat toast and sat at the stool nearest the kitchen window. Nora recognized the order. "You're Nilda Solis," she said. The woman looked at her with a measuring attention. "And you're the one who inherited Raymond's place. He mentioned you in a letter. He said you farmed the adjacent land and did it well." Nilda studied her. "Odd, he said that. He also said you'd be worth knowing if I decided to work the land." A silence that was not unfriendly, but was careful. The silence of a woman who had been in situations before where being worth knowing turned out to mean something she hadn't bargained for. "What do you want from the land?" Nora poured her coffee. She thought about the letter. She thought about what Raymond had said about good land waiting for the right person. She thought about 12 acres of flat Kansas stubble and what it could become. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'd like to learn." Nilda picked up her coffee. She looked at Nora over the rim of it with the assessing look of someone making a real decision. "Come out Saturday morning," she said. "I'll show you what I've been doing with the Eastfield, and then you can show me what you've got." Outside, the Hartwell Main Street was beginning its morning, the hardware store opening, the farm cooperative's trucks pulling in and out, the enormous sky doing what it always did, holding everything without comment. Somewhere in the middle distance, invisible from here, but present in the way of things that had become part of her understanding of herself, the silo stood in its rusted authority on 12 acres of flat Kansas land. All of it waiting for what came next. All of it, as Raymond had known for 40 years, in exactly the right hands. The probate hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in October, 10 weeks after Beverly had filed her petition. Clara had spent those 10 weeks building a defense that she described to Nora as methodical, which was Clara's word for thorough in a way that left nothing to chance. Leonard Pruitt had provided affidavits, his own, and those of the 2 witnesses present at each of Raymond's will revisions, attesting to his clear and organized state of mind on every occasion. Raymond's physician of 20 years, a doctor named Nora Hayes, who practiced in Garden City, provided medical records showing that Raymond had been assessed cognitively as recently as 14 months before his death and had performed at levels significantly above average for his age. His bank records, subpoenaed for the proceedings, showed the disciplined, consistent financial management of someone with complete command of their affairs. Clifton Price, Beverly's attorney, and I arrived at the Finney County courthouse with the particular confidence of a man who had won will contests before by applying steady pressure until the defending party made a mistake or ran out of patience. He was methodical in his own right, but his methodology was built on the assumption that the person he was contesting would eventually want it to be over, would eventually calculate that some settlement was preferable to continued conflict. He had not, Nora thought, correctly assessed who he was dealing with in this case. The courtroom was small, the kind of courtroom that handled the ordinary legal administration of a rural county, and it was fuller than its ordinary business warranted. News of the discovery had moved through Hartwell and Finney County in the way news moved through small communities, which was to say completely and with embellishments that were sometimes accurate and sometimes not. The people in the gallery were not hostile. They were curious, which was different, and some of them Nora recognized from the diner, from the hardware store, from the school where Cleo and Eli had been enrolled for 6 weeks now, and where they were, by all accounts from their teachers, doing well. Clara's presentation was 45 minutes. She moved through the evidence with the controlled precision of someone who knew exactly where every piece sat in the architecture of the argument, and who had built the architecture to withstand what was coming. The cognitive assessments, the financial records, the testimony from Leonard Pruitt, who sat in the witness stand with the unhurried manner of a man who had been telling the truth for 60 years and saw no particular reason to complicate the practice now. The affidavits from the will revision witnesses, both of whom had known Raymond Driscoll personally and described him as one of the most mentally disciplined people they had encountered in their professional lives. Then Clara called Raymond, not Raymond himself, but she put his words before the court. The document boxes from the chamber, the 40 years of organized field notes and correspondence and records, carried in carefully by David and stacked on the evidence table in a way that communicated, without a single word being said, the systematic and sustained intelligence of the man who had filled them. She had Clara point to each date range on each box label, and then read from the top document in each box, a single entry per box, Raymond's handwriting always the same, always precise, always the handwriting of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. She showed the court the second letter, the one left with Leonard to be given after assessment, and read the relevant passages aloud. The passage about his father teaching him to see value where others dismissed it. The passage about 60 years of systematic collecting. The passage about making sure the right person had the resources to act on their thinking. Judge Elaine Torrance had been on the Finney County bench for 19 years. She had seen will contests before. She had seen the full range of human behavior around inheritance, the grief and the greed and the genuine confusion and the manufactured grievance. She listened to Clara's presentation and to Clifton Price's counter-arguments with the same quality of attention, the even absorptive attention of someone who was building a picture and was not going to render a verdict until the picture was complete. When she spoke, she was precise and not unkind. The petition alleges diminished cognitive capacity, she said. The evidence presented to this court indicates a man who, at the time of executing and revising his will, was in full command of his faculties and had been for his entire documented adult life. The fact that his bequest was unconventional is not evidence of incapacity. Unconventional decisions are made every day by people of sound mind, The law protects the right of a competent adult to dispose of their property as they see fit, without requiring that their choices be explained to the satisfaction of those who might have preferred a different outcome. She looked at Clifton Price. The petition is dismissed with prejudice. Costs to the petitioner. Dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. Meaning it was done. The gallery made a sound that was not quite applause, more the collective exhale of a room full of people who had been holding something and had just been permitted to let it go. Nora sat at the plaintiff's table and felt Clara's hand briefly on her forearm, and felt the quality of the moment settling into her. Not triumphant, still not exactly triumphant, but solid, the solidity of a thing confirmed. Beverly and her attorney conferred in the corner of the room in low voices. Beverly's face had the particular quality of a person confronting an outcome they had told themselves was not possible. She caught Nora's eye once, across the room, and there was something in her expression that Nora could not fully read. Too complex for the courtroom, something that would need more privacy and more time to resolve itself. Nora held her gaze for a moment, and then looked away, not dismissively, but with the deliberate choice not to make the moment into something it didn't need to be. Outside on the courthouse steps in the October light, Hartwell's main street stretched in both directions, in the particular clarity of a plains autumn, the sky so blue it looked artificial. The cottonwood trees along the creek road already turning at their tips. Clara stood beside Nora and said nothing for a moment, which was Clara's version of a celebration. "What happens now?" Nora asked. "Now we prepare for the auctions." The first auction was in November. Professor Ewan had identified Christie's in New York as the appropriate venue for the top philatelic holdings, specifically the inverted Jenny block and the most significant of the Zeidgrill examples, and had spent 6 weeks working with Christie's specialized philatelic department to prepare the catalog entries and authenticate each piece for the specific requirements of that market. Nora had not gone to New York. She had decided, after some deliberation, that she would stay in Hartwell and wait for the results, because the auction belonged to the collection and to the history of the objects, and her presence in a room watching a bidding process would not add anything meaningful to the outcome, and would add a significant amount of anxiety to her own state. She heard from Clara by phone while she was at Garza's, standing in the kitchen with her back against the stainless steel prep table, looking through the pass-through at the Tuesday morning regulars. Clara's voice had the particular controlled quality of someone delivering information that exceeded the frameworks they had prepared for it. The inverted Jenny block. Opening bid, $3 million. Final sale, $41,200,000. A new world record for any single philatelic lot at auction, breaking the previous record by $11 million. The Zeidgrill pair. Final sale, $18,700,000. While the balance of the November lots, 32 additional items from the collection selected for the first auction, totaled an additional $69,400,000. The November auction alone, $129,300,000. Nora stood in the Garza's kitchen with the phone at her ear and looked through the pass-through at Rosie's back and at the Tuesday regulars drinking their coffee and eating their scrambled eggs, and she said, "Thank you, Clara," in a voice that she recognized as not quite her own, a voice that belonged to a person who was processing information at a rate that exceeded the processing capacity she currently had available. "There are 3 more auction tranches scheduled," Clara said, "February, May, and a final sale in August for the remaining holdings. Based on the November results, the total realized value of the collection may exceed current estimates." "By how much?" "I will know more after the February results, but the November auction established new market benchmarks for several categories. The buyers in that room paid those prices because they believe these pieces are worth that and more. The February lots are comparable in scope." A pause. Nora. The conservative total estimate has been revised upward. We are now looking at $310 to $340 million across all 4 tranches. $310 million. She had known the number approximately. She had lived with the approximate number for 10 weeks and had adjusted her thinking around it in the way you adjusted your thinking around anything you could not fully comprehend at first encounter, or by returning to it repeatedly and letting your understanding accumulate toward it. But the November auction results were not approximate. They were specific, verified, real. They had happened in a room in New York in front of witnesses with paddles and bidder numbers, and a Christie's auctioneer who had called the final number and brought the hammer down. She went back to work. She finished her shift. She drove home in the blue October afternoon light to the farmhouse on 12 acres, which was already a different farmhouse than it had been in August. The work on the farmhouse had begun in September, with the contracted crew she had hired through a recommendation from Nilda Solis, who knew everyone in the county who was worth knowing and several who weren't. The crew was efficient and straightforward in the way of people who had been doing structural repair in rural Kansas for a long time. They had replaced the porch, replastered the interior walls, replaced the 2 burned-out kitchen burners and the dripping faucet, repainted the exterior in a white that was close to the original, replaced the plywood over the upstairs windows with actual glass, and installed proper insulation throughout. The house was now warm in a way it had not been in 40 years, and it smelled of fresh plaster and new wood and the particular clean smell of a space that had been returned to function from long disuse. Cleo had chosen the color for her bedroom. She had chosen a deep blue-green, the color of old glass, which she said she had seen in a painting at the school library, and which, on the walls of her room with the afternoon light coming through the west window, was exactly right. Eli had chosen yellow, not cautiously, not a soft or muted yellow, but the yellow of something that genuinely believed in itself, and his room in the afternoons was the warmest room in the house. Nora had taken Raymond's bedroom for herself. She had repainted it and replaced the bed and the furniture, but she had kept his bookshelf exactly as he had left it, the agricultural journals and history books, and the volumes on philately and numismatics arranged in the order he had placed them. She read from them at night sometimes, not systematically, but the way you picked up something because it was there, and found yourself staying in it longer than you expected, might because the voice in the margins was the voice of a man who had been careful with his attention and generous with it to the things he found worth understanding. She kept his field notes on the shelf, too, the document boxes from the chamber, now returned from Clara's inventory and reinstalled in the chamber, which was clean and properly lit and no longer sealed, but open and accessible, a room in the base of the silo that Eli had taken to referring to as the treasure room without self-consciousness, because he was 5 and the word was accurate. On a Saturday morning in late October, she went to the east field with Nilda Solis. Nilda had been farming the adjacent 20 acres for 15 years with her son Marco, now 28, who had grown up in those fields and had the kind of knowledge of that specific piece of ground that could not be taught but only accumulated, season by season, the knowledge of how this particular soil held water and released it, how it responded to different amendments, how the drainage ran after a heavy rain, and where the dry spots were in a summer drought. He was quiet in the way of people who had learned that the land provided more information per hour than conversation did, and who had organized their priorities accordingly. They walked the 12 acres together, all 3 of them, on a morning so clear that the mountains to the west, invisible in summer haze, were faintly visible as a suggestion on the horizon. Aunt Nilda and Marco pointed out what they saw in the ground, and Nora listened with the full quality of attention she had always brought to things she found important. The soil on the north section was tired, Nilda said. 20 years of wind erosion and neglect had compacted the upper layers and reduced the organic content to something that would take several seasons of careful amendment to restore. But the south section, protected by the silo's windbreak, was different. The soil there had accumulated organic matter from the dry grass stubble and the sage that had established itself, and its structure was better than the rest. She crouched and took a handful and let it fall through her fingers, and it fell with the particular quality of soil that still had life in it, that had not been entirely depleted. "This is where you start," she said, "if you want to start." "What would you grow?" Nora asked. Nilda looked at the field for a long moment. "Winter wheat in the north section, once we amend. It's traditional here, it suits the climate, and it doesn't ask too much of compromised soil. The south section is different. The south section could do something else." She looked at Nora. "What do you want from the land?" It was the same question she had asked on the first day at Garza's, and Nora had not been ready to answer it then. She was more ready now. "Raymond said the land had been waiting for someone to work it properly," she said. "I want to work it properly. I want it to be something real, something that feeds people." Nilda's expression shifted in a way that was subtle enough that you would miss it if you were not paying attention. A small relaxation at the corners, a quality of recognition. She had heard something she was waiting to hear. "The south section," she said, "with the right amendments and the right planning, could grow heritage wheat varieties. Old Kansas strains, some of them nearly lost. There's a small mill in Dodge City that handles heritage grain. The market for it, flour for artisan bakers, small restaurants, people who care what wheat tastes like, is growing. It's not a commodity crop. It doesn't scale the way industrial wheat does. But it's worth something more per bushel, and it feeds the ground at the same time." Nora stood in the October field and looked at the flat land and the enormous sky and thought about 6 years of opening a bakery at 4:30 in the morning and learning every recipe by heart and loving it, the actual loving it, the satisfaction of making something real with your hands that fed people. She thought about worms having feelings, the question that had started all of this across 26 years and 1,000 miles. The question that was, when you examined it closely, a question about what the small things we overlook were actually experiencing. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." Marco nodded. Once, the nod of a person who has been given a project worth taking on. He said they would start with soil testing the following week, and that he had a contact at Kansas State who specialized in heritage grain restoration, who might want to be involved. He said this without excitement, in the manner of a man for whom good work was its own sufficient context, and Nora recognized the manner and appreciated it. She called Dana that evening, and it was the first call she had initiated since the one in August, where she had said she had made her decision, and Dana had let the argument go. 10 weeks of silence between them, not hostile exactly, but carrying the weight of things unsaid on both sides. Dana answered with the careful quality of someone who had been thinking about how this call would go and had prepared several openings. "The court dismissed Beverly's petition," Nora said, "with prejudice." A pause. "I heard. Leonard Pruitt told someone and it got around." Another pause. "I want to say something, Nora, and I want to say it without it being part of an argument about anything." "Okay. I should not have said what I said about the silo, about it not being a solution to anything." Dana's voice had the quality of someone working against their own habits, for Dana's habits ran toward confidence and the confident delivery of assessments, and the dismantling of a confident assessment required deliberate effort. "I said it because I was afraid for you, and I didn't know how to say that without it coming out as criticism." "I know," Nora said. "I still think it was reasonable on the available information." "Dana." A beat. Yes. You don't have to justify it. I know you were afraid for me. I was afraid too. The children, Dana said, and there was something genuine in it. The particular love of an aunt for children she had not seen enough of. Are they okay? Are they settled? They're doing well. Eli loves his teacher. Cleo has decided she wants to be a soil scientist, which is a recent development. A pause. I want you to come visit. I want you to see what we're building. I'd like that, Dana said, and it was the simplest thing she had said in the entire length of their relationship, which Nora thought might mean something. She did not call Beverly. Beverly called her, 2 weeks after the court ruling, on an evening when Nora was sitting on the repaired porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars come up over the flat eastern horizon, which in western Kansas happened with a particular clarity. The stars emerging not one at a time, but in gathering groups, as though the sky were remembering them. Beverly's number came up on her phone, and Nora looked at it for 2 rings before answering. Beverly said hello. She said she was calling because she thought they should talk. She said she wanted Nora to know that she held no hard feelings, which was a complicated thing to say given the circumstances, but which Nora chose to receive as the most honest gesture Beverly knew how to make. I want you to understand something, Beverly said, after a silence that had been working its way toward honesty. We all looked at that property and we saw what it appeared to be. Old and run down and not worth anything. I made my judgment based on appearances and I was wrong. A pause. Raymond knew what was there the whole time. He chose you, and I think he was right to. The last sentence came out in a way that suggested it had cost something, and Nora felt the cost of it and respected it. Thank you, Beverly, she said. That means something. I still think he was eccentric, Beverly said, recovering slightly. He absolutely was, Nora agreed. A brief pause that contained the possibility of laughter, which did not fully materialize, but which was present as a potential, which was more than there had been before. Take care of yourself, Beverly said. Take care of those kids. I will. She sat on the porch for a long time after that call, in the cold, clear October night, with the stars doing what they always did in western Kansas, which was everything all at once, without apology or moderation. She thought about Raymond sitting on this same porch on 40 years of evenings, like this one, looking at these same stars, with the knowledge of what was in the chamber under the silo, and the patience to wait for the right person, and the confidence that the right person would come. She thought about the particular quality of faith that required, not faith in a system or an institution, but faith in the possibility that the specific kind of attention you valued in the world would, if you waited long enough and prepared well enough, find its way to someone who shared it. The February auction produced $93,200,000. The May auction, which included the remaining Zed grill examples and a substantial portion of the 19th century American postal history holdings, produced $87,600,000. The August final sale, the close of the collection's public life, produced $61,400,000. Total auction proceeds across all 4 tranches, $371,500,000. It exceeded even Clara's revised upward estimate. Professor Ewan, who had attended each auction in person and had sent Nora a brief note after each one, sent a final note after the August sale that said only, he knew exactly what he had. After taxes, after legal fees, after the full cost of the estate proceedings, Nora Hayes received net proceeds of $247,300,000. She sat with that number for 3 days before she began to decide what to do with it. She sat with it, not because she was paralyzed, but because she had learned, from Raymond and from the particular discipline of her own life, that important decisions made from stillness were better than important decisions made from the momentum of the moment. She walked the fields in the morning with Nilda and Marco, who had by now amended the south section and seeded it with the first heritage wheat varieties, a drought-tolerant strain called Turkey Red that had been grown in Kansas since Mennonite settlers brought it from Russia in the 1870s, and which stood now in the November field in its first green emergence, low and faintly silver in the early light, more beautiful than Nora had expected. She worked her 3 shifts at Garza's because she had not told Rosie she was stopping, and because she did not want to stop, because the work was good, and Rosie was good, and the regulars at the counter were people who had accepted her into the ordinary fabric of Hartwell with the easy generosity of a community that had decided, collectively and without announcement, that she was one of theirs. She had the children's school life. Cleo had joined the school's science club and had begun a project on soil composition, which her teacher had encouraged with a specificity that suggested the teacher understood she had a student who was genuinely interested rather than performing interest. Eli had made a friend named Tomas, Nilda's grandson, who was also 5, also thoughtful in his attention to things, and who came over on Saturdays and spent hours with Eli in a collaborative project, whose nature shifted weekly, but whose intensity never diminished. These were the coordinates of her actual life. This was what the money needed to support and extend and make more possible, not replace. She spent a week writing things down, not a formal plan, not the kind of document Clara's office would produce, but a personal record of what she wanted the money to do, what it needed to protect, what she wanted it to build. She wrote it in the kitchen in the mornings before the children were up, at the table where Raymond's second letter had been read aloud, with the window facing east and the first light coming across the flat land and the turkey red wheat catching it in the south field, green and silver and present. The first category was security, a trust for each child, funded at $15 million each, managed conservatively, structured so that the money was available for education and for starting a life, but not for a 25-year-old to spend without thought. Clara designed the structures. She said Raymond would have approved of the specific terms, which was the highest compliment Clara gave to anything. The second category was the land. She invested $3 million in a 5-year land restoration program, working with Marco and his contact at Kansas State, a professor named Dr. Adaora Williams, who specialized in heritage grain restoration and who came to the property in November with the barely contained excitement of a scientist given access to something she had been theorizing about for years. The program would restore the north section's soil health, expand the heritage wheat cultivation, and in the 3rd year introduce a small orchard on the eastern edge where the shelter belt of cottonwoods provided natural wind protection. The orchard would take years to produce. That was fine. Raymond had taught her how to think about years. The 3rd category was the people, Nilda and Marco Solis. She offered them a formal partnership in the farm operation, not charity and not employment, but an actual equity stake in the agricultural enterprise because they had knowledge and skill and commitment to the land that she did not have and could not have acquired quickly, and because the right response to someone who had what you needed was not to buy it, but to share with it. Nilda received the offer with the same measuring stillness she brought to everything, and then she said yes in the same way she said everything, without embellishment, meaning it completely. Rosie Garza. Nora did not offer Rosie money. Rosie would not have taken it. What she offered was something Rosie had mentioned once, briefly, and without expectation, in the context of a conversation about the diner's building, which Rosie rented, and whose landlord had been raising the rate annually for 6 years. Nora bought the building and offered Rosie a 30-year lease at the rate that had been current the year Nora arrived in Hartwell, which was the rate before the increases had begun. Rosie stood behind the counter when Nora told her and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was complicated in ways Rosie generally did not permit her expressions to be. "That's too much," Rosie said. "It's the right amount," Nora said. "Raymond ate scrambled eggs and wheat toast at your counter every Tuesday for how long?" 30 years, near enough. "Then he was part of what makes this place worth owning. I'm honoring that." Rosie poured coffee that didn't need to be poured and said nothing for a moment. Then, "He would have liked you knowing that about him." The Raymond Driscoll Foundation came next, and was the thing Nora thought about most carefully and for the longest time, because it was the part that was about Raymond's legacies in the most direct sense, and she wanted to get it right. She had talked with Professor Ewan, and with Patricia Holt, and with Leonard Pruitt, and with Clara, and with the University of Kansas's Special Collections librarian, a woman named Dr. Josephine Carr, who had been in contact since the auction results became public, about what the right form was for honoring a collection of this significance. What she settled on was not a museum and not a foundation in the traditional sense, but something closer to what Raymond had built in the chamber. A center for the preservation and study of American philatelic and numismatic history, unhoused at the University of Kansas, with a significant endowment that guaranteed its independence from year-to-year budget pressures. $40 million. Professor Ewan agreed to chair the advisory board. Dr. Carr agreed to serve as founding director. The center would acquire material, preserve it, study it, and make it accessible to scholars and to the public, because objects of genuine rarity and historical significance deserved to be preserved, held together, and kept safe, exactly as Raymond had written. The center would be called the Driscoll Collection, not the Driscoll Museum, not the Raymond Allen Driscoll Memorial Institution. The Driscoll Collection, which was what it had always been, what he had spent 60 years building, the coherent thing that carried its value because it was coherent. Leonard Pruitt told her, when she presented the plan to him, that he thought Raymond would have been uncomfortable with the naming. "I know," Nora said. "He can be uncomfortable. He should be named." The announcement of the Driscoll Collection was made at a press conference in Hartwell in January, 17 months after Nora had received the call from Leonard Pruitt in room 11 of the Sundown Motor Inn. She had agreed to the press conference because Clara had advised that a single, controlled, properly prepared public statement was better than the ongoing accumulation of partial information and speculation that had been circulating for months. She had asked for it to be held in Hartwell, not in Wichita, and not in Kansas City, and not in New York, because this was where the story had happened, and this was where she lived. The diner was not large enough. The event was held in the Hartwell Community Center, a building that had seen baptism receptions and 4-H awards and school holiday programs and the occasional contentious town meeting, and which was now standing room only for the first time in anyone's recent memory. Local press, 2 regional television stations, 3 national publications, Professor Ewan, Patricia Holt, Dr. Carr, Clara, Leonard Pruitt, Nilda and Marco, Rosie, Cleo's teacher, Eli's teacher, and what appeared to be the better part of Hartwell itself, dressed in the way people dressed for something they had decided was important. Nora stood at the front of the room with Cleo on her left and Eli on her right, and she did not have a speech in the way of a prepared text, because she had found, in the 17 months since the discovery, that the things worth saying were not improved by being written down in advance. She told them about room 11 of the Sundown Motor Inn. She told them about the classified ad, and the phone call to Leonard Pruitt, and the drive across the Kansas plains with $62.40 and 2 children who thought it was an adventure. She told them about the letter behind the cabinet, and the key taped to the inside of the envelope, and the wax seal with the circle and the line, which she had come to understand, was Raymond's private mark, the notation of a person who had designed his own small language for the things that mattered. She told them about the door in the north face of the silo, and the chamber in the dark, and the flashlight moving across the shelves. She told them about Raymond. She read sections of both his letters, and she told them about the worm conversation, which she had been carrying for 26 years, without knowing it was a conversation that would eventually matter in this particular way. She said that Raymond Driscoll had spent 60 years paying attention to things other people did not think were worth attention, and that the result of that attention was in the Driscoll collection at the University of Kansas, and that the other result, the one standing in this room, was her family's life in Hartwell. She said that the lesson she had taken from Raymond was not about gold coins or stamps or the prices they had realized at auction. The lesson was about attention, about the willingness to take something seriously before you knew whether it would be worth taking seriously, about the patience to build toward a thing you believed in, incrementally and over years, without requiring that the outcome arrive quickly. She said that she had been afraid in the sundown motor inn in a way that she thought might not stop, and that the fear had not been resolved by the money. The money was real, and it had changed things in real and lasting ways, and she was not going to pretend that it hadn't. But what had resolved the fear was the discovery, before the money, that there was something in the silo worth finding. That attention had been paid to her, specifically, carefully, from a distance of 26 years, by a man who had asked a 7-year-old girl what she thought about, and had found her answer sufficient to trust her with everything he had. That was what she wanted people to know. That was the thing worth saying. The room was quiet when she finished. Then Rosie Garza started clapping from the third row, which she did with the decisive authority of a woman who had decided this was when the clapping should start, and the room followed. Eli leaned against Nora's side and said quietly into the general noise of the room, "Are we famous now?" Nora put her arm around him. "A little bit," she said. "Okay," he said, and appeared to file this under things that were fine and not requiring further concern. Cleo was looking out at the room with the expression she brought to things she was processing seriously, the accountant's face, the face that was assembling data. "Did Raymond know it would be like this?" she asked. "When he decided to leave it to you, did he know all this would happen?" Nora thought about that, about the letters and their careful preparation, about the provision for legal defense built into the estate instructions, about the timing of the key, the placement of the envelope, the way everything had been arranged to find the right person at the right moment. "I think he hoped," she said, "and I think he prepared for it as thoroughly as he could. And then he trusted that the rest would work out. Because he trusted you. Because he trusted the kind of person he believed I was, which isn't exactly the same thing." Cleo considered this distinction with the seriousness it deserved. "But you were the right kind of person," she said. "It was not a question." "I tried to be," Nora said. "I hope so." After the press conference, and after the journalists with their recorders and their notebooks had asked their questions and been answered with the careful precision Clara had coached and the genuine warmth that did not require coaching, after Professor Ewan had given a separate statement about the Driscoll collection that had made Dr. Carr visibly emotional in the way of people who spend their careers hoping for exactly this kind of thing, and occasionally receive it, after Rosie had served coffee and the Garza's wheat toast that had become, through the alchemy of story, something people now sought out specifically on their Tuesday mornings in the knowledge that Raymond Driscoll had sat at that counter for 30 years. After all of that had finished, and the community center had slowly emptied, Nora took the children and walked home. They walked the 2 miles from the community center to the farmhouse because it was January and clear and cold, and the light on the flat Kansas land in January was specific and clean in a way that the summer heat obscured, and because she wanted to be outside in it. Eli insisted on walking between them and held both their hands for the first mile, and then released himself to walk ahead at the distance of a person who needed slightly more space for the full range of movement his preferred walking style required. Cleo walked beside Nora and said very little, which meant she was thinking. When the farmhouse came into view, and beside it, the silo, Cleo stopped walking for a moment and looked at it. The late afternoon light caught the corrugated steel at a low angle and turned it the color of old copper, the rust becoming not decay, but something warmer, a patina, the color of something that had been here long enough to become part of the landscape. "Are we going to fix it up?" Cleo asked. "The silo. Are we going to repaint it?" Nora looked at it. She had thought about this. She had thought about restoration, about returning the silo to something closer to its original condition, blue-gray paint and clean steel. But every time she had considered it, she had found herself returning to what it looked like right now, in the rust and the age and the decades of weather, and not wanting to change it. "No," she said. "I think we leave it as it is." Cleo looked at her. "Why?" "Because it earned that color," Nora said. "Because it stood out here in the weather for 60 years, doing what it was supposed to do, so which was hold things safe until the right time. The rust is what that looks like. I don't want to paint over it." Cleo looked back at the silo for a moment more. "Like a record," she said. "Like the way it looks is a record of what it did." "Yes," Nora said. "Exactly like that." They walked the rest of the way home in the winter light, past the south field where the turkey red wheat stood in its winter dormancy, waiting for the spring that would bring it upward, past the oak that had been there longer than the silo, and which had dropped its leaves into the dry grass in a copper ring, past the shed where the hand tools Raymond had kept in careful condition still hung on their pegboard, labeled in his handwriting, waiting to be used. Eli ran ahead and got to the porch first, and sat on the step, and looked at the sky with his particular receptive attention, the attention of a 5-year-old boy who had been told, in the most practical terms possible, that the world contained more than it appeared to contain, and who had absorbed this information as confirmation of something he had already suspected. Nora stood at the edge of the yard for a moment before going in. She looked at the farmhouse, clean and warm and hers, the porch rebuilt and solid, the windows glassed and reflecting the last of the light. She looked at the silo, 40 feet of patient corrugated rust against the enormous blue. She thought about Raymond on this same ground, on an evening very like this one, understanding what was in the chamber under his feet, and choosing to wait, and choosing to keep it until the person arrived who was right for it, the person who would find it because they cleaned a house the way it deserved to be cleaned and looked where other people didn't think to look. She thought about the patience of that, the extraordinary, sustained, deliberate patience. And she thought about herself at 7 years old, walking up to a strange man at a holiday gathering and asking him what he thought about, not because she was trying to say the right thing, but because she was genuinely curious, because she was a child who found other people's inner lives interesting and had not yet learned to manage that curiosity into something more socially appropriate, and because she had said, when asked in return, that she thought about worms, about whether they had feelings, because she did, and she actually did think about that regularly, and it had seemed to her then, and seemed to her now, like a reasonable and important thing to think about. Raymond had said it was a very important thing to think about. He had laughed his real laugh, and not his polite laugh, and she had known the difference even at 7. She had kept that, without knowing she was keeping it. The way you kept things that landed in you correctly, that found the right place, and stayed there even when you had no framework for understanding why. Take care of the children. The world is better when people who think about worms have the resources to act on their thinking. The stars were starting to appear, the first ones, the ones bright enough to register before the sky had finished its blue. She could see them from where she stood, at the edge of the yard, set between the farmhouse light behind her and the silo's rust-dark shape ahead. She went inside. She made dinner. She made the pasta from the electric kettle, which was still the children's request when they had a good day and wanted to mark it as such, though they were now making it on an actual stove in an actual kitchen with enough room to move in, which Cleo had pointed out was technically a different recipe, and which Eli had pointed out was still their recipe because they were the ones who asked for it. She made it on the stove, and they ate it at the kitchen table, the three of them, in the warm house on 12 acres of flat Kansas land, with the wheat dormant in the south field and the silo standing sentinel in the dark outside the window, and the document boxes on the shelf in the bedroom, and the empty chamber in the silo's base, clean and lit and open, its work done, its secret spent, resting now in the easy rest of something that has completed its purpose. Eli ate quickly, and then looked up with the expression of someone who has been thinking about something through the meal and has reached a conclusion. "Mama," he said. "Yeah, baby. If Raymond could see us right now, would he be happy?" She looked at him. She thought about the letter, about "I have believed since you were 7 years old," about "take care of the children." "I think so," she said. "I think he'd be very happy." Eli nodded. This was sufficient. He went back to his pasta. Cleo looked at Nora across the table with her full, direct, considering attention. "What are you going to do next?" she asked. "Now that the auctions are finished, and the foundation is set up and everything, what comes next?" Nora thought about turkey red wheat emerging in the spring. She thought about Nilda's East Field and what Marco had said about the third-year orchard. She thought about Garza's on Tuesday morning and the particular small satisfaction of scrambled eggs made properly. She thought about the soil scientist Cleo was becoming and the way Eli had started asking questions about what grew in the shelter belt cottonwoods and whether she could get him a field guide. "This," she said. "This comes next." Cleo looked at her steadily. "That's not nothing." "No," Nora agreed. "It is absolutely not nothing." Outside, the January night settled over the western Kansas plains in the way it had always settled, deep and clear and indifferent to human scale. The stars doing their ancient, enormous work above the flat horizon, above the farmhouse and the wheat field, and the silo standing in its rust against the dark, above 12 acres that had been waiting, in their patient way, for exactly this. A woman who thought about worms, her children who thought about everything. A quiet man's 60 years of careful attention, fulfilled at last in the hands he had always intended for it. The world had not become simpler. The world was not without its difficulties, and its pressures, and its Beverly calls, and its Curtis Hales, and its Gerald at the motels waiting around every corner. The world was exactly as hard as it had always been. But Nora Hayes was in it differently now. She was in it with the knowledge that attention was not wasted, that patience was not naivety, that the things other people overlooked were often the things with the most to offer. She was in it with a farmhouse and 12 acres and a silo full of completed purpose, and children who were sleeping in rooms the colors they had chosen, and a partner who knew the land, and a neighbor who made good coffee, and a grain in the ground that had crossed an ocean and survived 150 Kansas winters and was coming up again in the spring, as it always had, because it was a thing that knew how to endure. She washed the dishes in the warm kitchen. She listened to the quiet of the house. She went out on the porch one last time in the cold, clear night and stood for a minute looking at the silo, which she would always look at before she went inside, because it was the thing that had been there first, and it was the thing that had made everything possible, and it had earned the looking. Then she went in and turned off the light, and the night continued its enormous patient work without her, as it always had, as it always would. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.